Imagine discovering that, while you watch this video, thousands of young soldiers who have never seen the world beyond the iron borders of North Korea are paying with their lives on frozen battlefields in Russia. We are talking about more than 4,000 confirmed casualties in just a few months of fighting. For the first time in modern history, Kim Jong-un broke decades of military isolation and sent his elite troops to fight in a foreign region, and the result has been devastating. This is not just another news story about the conflict in Ukraine. It is the first time North Korean soldiers have participated in international military conflict since the 1950s, and the numbers coming from the front lines are absolutely alarming. In October 2024, something unprecedented began to happen. Satellite images and Western intelligence reports confirmed that North Korea had sent between 10,000 and 14,000 soldiers to support Russian operations in the Kursk region on the border with Ukraine. Initially, both Pyongyang and Moscow denied any direct involvement, keeping this military operation completely secret. However, in April 2025, Kim Jong-un did something completely unprecedented. He publicly confirmed, for the first time, that he had sent troops to fight alongside Russia. This admission came alongside devastating numbers. According to the South Korean intelligence agency, by January 2025, approximately 300 North Korean soldiers had lost their lives, while another 2,700 were wounded. But the numbers keep rising. More recent reports from Ukrainian and Western officials indicate that casualties may have reached 4,000 soldiers, representing approximately one-third of all troops sent. To put this into perspective, imagine an entire military force being decimated in just a few months. We are talking about young men who grew up completely isolated from the outside world, sent to face one of the most advanced and lethal combat forms of the modern era. To understand the magnitude of this decision, we need to go back in time. North Korea has maintained one of the world's strictest military isolation policies for over 70 years. Since the end of North Korean involvement in the Vietnam confrontation in the 1960s, the Pyongyang regime had never sent troops for direct combat on foreign soil. So what changed? The answer lies in a bilateral military agreement signed in 2024 between Putin and Kim Jong-un. This pact was a desperate exchange of resources for military support. Russia, facing enormous losses in its campaign in Ukraine and growing difficulties in recruiting new soldiers, offered North Korea something Kim Jong-un could not refuse: advanced military technology, essential fuel to keep its economy running, and critical components for its missile defense systems. In exchange, Kim Jong-un committed to providing not only ammunition and equipment, but also what Russia needed most: trained and disciplined soldiers. For the North Korean leader, this seemed like a unique opportunity to modernize his armed forces and gain real combat experience, something his troops had never experienced. But there was a terrible calculation behind this decision. Kim Jong-un was essentially using his own soldiers as bargaining chips, betting that the technological and economic benefits would outweigh the inevitable human losses. It was a roulette game with human lives, and the consequences soon appeared. The North Korean soldiers who arrived in the Kursk region in October 2024 represented some of the best units of the country's armed forces. But nothing in their training had prepared them for what they would encounter on the Ukrainian battlefields. Imagine young men who grew up in a society where the internet is practically non-existent, where the most advanced military technology they knew were pieces of equipment from the 1980s and 90s, suddenly confronted with autonomous drones hunting them like invisible predators. These soldiers faced satellite-guided precision artillery systems, long-range missiles provided by Ukraine's Western allies, and combat tactics incorporating artificial intelligence and real-time reconnaissance. The result was devastating. Field reports describe horrific scenes: North Korean soldiers trying to hide from drones that track them with surgical precision, using cover tactics that were effective decades ago but completely inadequate against modern technology. Many carried obsolete equipment and had no experience with the integrated communication systems used by Russian forces. One particularly tragic episode occurred in January 2025 near the city of Makhnovka, where military observers visually confirmed more than 400 casualties in a single day of fighting. These were not just statistical numbers. They were young men who had left their families in North Korea believing they were serving a glorious cause. While these events unfolded on the frozen battlefields of the Kursk region, a parallel and equally devastating crisis was happening within North Korea itself. For a regime that has always built its legitimacy on the promise of protecting its citizens and maintaining family unity as a pillar of society, the rising casualties represented an unprecedented challenge. The families of the soldiers sent to Russia found themselves in an impossible situation. Initially, many did not even know that their sons, husbands, or brothers had been dispatched to a foreign conflict. The regime kept the operation completely secret, and the soldiers were instructed not to maintain contact with their families during the period of special training. As the weeks turned into months, the absence of news began to generate anxiety and suspicion. In a society where information is strictly controlled, rumors started circulating quietly. Some families received unexpected visits from military officers who provided vague statements about patriotic service on a special mission, or, in most tragic cases, dry notifications about death in service to the homeland. The psychological impact was immense. Veterans of the North Korean armed forces, who had always lived with the certainty that their duties were limited to defending national territory, began to question whether volunteering for special missions might mean a death sentence. Reports from defectors indicate that morale within the armed forces plummeted, with soldiers expressing fears of being the next ones selected for similar missions. Temperatures frequently dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, and North Korean soldiers, coming from a country where winter is harsh but familiar, found themselves fighting in completely unknown terrain, equipped with clothing and gear inadequate for the specific conditions of European combat. The most detailed reports come from Ukrainian soldiers who engaged directly with North Korean troops. They describe brave and disciplined adversaries, but visibly disoriented and poorly equipped for the type of conflict they were facing. Many North Korean soldiers were found carrying photographs of their families and small personal items, suggesting they knew they might not return home. One of the most moving discoveries was the diaries and personal notes found with dead soldiers. Some had written messages to their families, expressing confusion about why they were fighting in a foreign land so far from home. Other documents revealed that many genuinely believed they were participating in a special military exercise or an advanced training mission, only discovering the deadly reality of the situation when it was too late. North Korea's participation in the Ukrainian conflict has created shockwaves that extend far beyond the battlefields. This move represents a fundamental reshaping of global alliances and the strategic calculations of the major world powers. China, traditionally North Korea's closest ally, found itself in an extremely delicate position. Beijing needs to balance its historic support for Pyongyang with the need to maintain relatively stable relations with the West and avoid additional economic sanctions. North Korea's direct involvement in a conflict that has already strained Sino-Western relations has placed China in a position where any move can have significant consequences. On the Western side, the presence of North Korean troops has completely transformed the nature of the Ukrainian conflict. It is no longer just a regional dispute between Russia and Ukraine, but a confrontation that directly involves the so-called authoritarian axis formed by Russia, China, North Korea, and implicitly, other aligned regimes. The United States and NATO have been forced to reevaluate their strategies not only for Eastern Europe, but for the entire global security architecture. The demonstration that isolated regimes can be mobilized to support military operations in completely different regions represents a new form of international confrontation that Western defense planners had not fully anticipated. While the world debates the geopolitical implications of these events, a silent humanitarian crisis is unfolding within North Korea. The return of severely wounded soldiers to an already precarious healthcare system is creating challenges that the regime is struggling to hide. Military hospitals in Pyongyang and other major cities are being secretly overwhelmed with wounded soldiers requiring specialized medical care. Many of the returning soldiers suffered injuries caused by modern weaponry that North Korean doctors had never treated before. Explosive drone burns, GPS-guided fragmentation artillery wounds, and psychological trauma resulting from high-intensity combat are medical conditions that significantly exceed the country's healthcare system capacity. More disturbing are reports about how the regime is dealing with wounded veterans. In a society that has always glorified military strength and national invincibility, soldiers returning with visible disabilities represent an inconvenient reminder of the true cost of Kim Jong-un's military adventure. Many veterans are being quietly isolated or sent to remote medical facilities away from public view. The families of these soldiers face a terrible dilemma. On one hand, they are grateful to have their loved ones back alive. On the other, many of those who returned are deeply traumatized and changed by the experience. In a society where psychological support is practically non-existent and expressing mental trauma is seen as weakness, these veterans and their families face a lonely and silent recovery. The central irony of this whole tragedy is that Kim Jong-un initially justified sending troops as an opportunity to modernize and strengthen the North Korean armed forces through real combat experience. In theory, soldiers who survived the conflict would return with valuable knowledge about modern tactics, familiarity with advanced equipment, and practical experience that could be passed on to the rest of the armed forces. In practice, the result was almost the opposite. The soldiers who returned brought with them not only physical injuries, but also a sober understanding of how outdated and inadequate North Korean military preparation is for modern conflicts. Many veterans began to quietly question the effectiveness of the training they received and the adequacy of the equipment with which they were prepared. Some veterans returned with an expanded perspective on the outside world that goes far beyond what the government would like its citizens to know. Even during intense combat, these soldiers were exposed to technologies, tactics, and even aspects of Western culture through captured equipment, interactions with prisoners, and simply the experience of being outside the completely controlled environment of North Korea. The regime now faces the challenge of dealing with soldiers who possess experience and knowledge that exceed what is considered safe for ordinary North Korean citizens to know. This situation is creating internal tensions that the government is actively working to control and suppress. Despite the devastating losses, more recent reports indicate that the remaining North Korean troops have demonstrated a remarkable capacity to adapt. Soldiers who were initially decimated by drones and modern tactics began developing countermeasures and defensive strategies. This evolution represents both a testament to the discipline and training of North Korea's elite troops and a growing concern for Ukrainian forces. Military analysts have observed that the North Koreans have become particularly skilled in using smaller drones and adapting guerrilla tactics to combat Ukrainian technological superiority. They have also shown the ability to quickly learn from more advanced Russian systems and integrate this knowledge into their operations. This adaptation, however, came at an additional cost in human lives. The process of learning by doing in an active combat environment means that each military lesson was paid for with blood. For every successful tactic developed, dozens of soldiers paid the ultimate price during the trial and error period. Recent reports suggest that Kim Jong-un is considering sending additional troops to replace the losses suffered, possibly increasing the total contingent to more than 15,000 soldiers. This decision would face significant internal resistance, especially as news of the high casualty rates quietly spreads among the population. The political sustainability of this military operation is becoming questionable. Even in an authoritarian regime like North Korea, there is a limit to how many human losses the population can silently accept, especially when the promised benefits of the operation are not materializing as expected. Internationally, the continuation of North Korean involvement will likely result in additional sanctions and greater diplomatic isolation. Countries that previously maintained neutral or slightly positive relations with Pyongyang are being pressured to take firmer positions against the regime. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about how decisions made in distant government meeting rooms translate into real and tangible human tragedies. Each of the 4,000 North Korean casualties represents not just a military statistic, but a life interrupted, a family destroyed, and dreams and aspirations that will never be fulfilled. For the North Korean soldiers who survived and returned home, the experience in Ukraine will likely mark them for the rest of their lives. They carry not only physical scars, but also the knowledge that they were sent to a conflict they did not fully understand, to serve political goals that may never be realized. This situation also raises fundamental questions about the responsibility of political leaders regarding the lives of the citizens they govern. Kim Jong-un made a decision that cost thousands of young soldiers lives in exchange for uncertain technological and economic benefits. This cold calculation between human lives and strategic advantages represents one of the darkest faces of modern international politics. As always, I leave you with a question for reflection. To what extent should governments have the right to send their citizens to conflicts that do not directly threaten national security? And what is our responsibility as international observers when witnessing decisions that result in significant human losses? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn more about the events shaping our world. See you on the next battlefield.